Okay, so good morning all. I'm really pleased to be joining Lisa Cherry here for a summary session around the first season of work that Lisa's been doing with a number of iconic speakers and well-recognised individuals, particularly around the field of thinking about trauma, resilience and recovery. So Lisa Cherry, trainer, speaker, author, good morning.
Hello, John. This is very strange. I'm being interviewed on my own podcast. How weird is that? So, John, you have to ask me all sorts of
Wow.
questions, and I have to be really good and not ask you too many, which is going to
Okay,
be
so
really hard.
well, let me start by asking what inspired you to start this podcast series? I'm really interested to know where the journey began, essentially.
Okay, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, I think initially why I started doing the podcast, and I can't believe I've done an entire season of 30 episodes. It's been amazing, and people's willingness to share their work and their thoughts and where they're at in their local areas has been phenomenal. But what I wanted to really do was build some bridges. I mean, firstly, I'm really interested in sharing voice and
Yeah.
story. So giving people a platform to talk about what they do, how they do it, what motivates them, is really important to me. But I think what's also really important to me is that we build bridges between each other, because the blame and shame, what happens when you take away resources from people
Mm-hmm.
is that somebody is at fault.
Yeah.
And when you are confronted every day with people in dire need,
Mm-hmm.
then looking for that person to blame becomes a very almost human instinctive thing. And what I was seeing, which in a sense, we might say if we keep people fighting with each other, then they're not going to fight where it needs to be fought. We could take that sort of sociological
Yeah.
perspective.
Uh-huh.
But what I saw happening was people saying, oh, it's CAMS, oh, it's education, oh, it's social services, social workers, oh, it's,
Mm-hmm.
it's, there is always somebody, it's housing, it's drug and alcohol services, it's health, and what I wanted to do was really give people an opportunity to listen to people in different sectors, because I'm lucky enough to work across all the sectors, which gives me a real flavour of some of the challenges and some of the triumphs that are going on around the country. And
I think one of the things, if I could interrupt, one of the things I've been most impressed with is the fact that it's very much a sort of multi-professional and, if you like, interdisciplinary way of looking at the same kind of experience for our children and young people.
yeah, and that was what I really wanted, that, and largely because, again, as a trainer, I'm very blessed because that's my work. When you are completely and utterly focused on doing what's got to be done, it can be very hard to think outside of that environment, that organization, that local area. And so I wanted people to, in a way that was really accessible, see some of the things I was seeing, hear some of the things that I was hearing,
Mm-hmm.
and connect people around the country who might want to share practice, who might want to build bridges with each other. I just wanted it to be a resource, a
Yeah.
kind of gift of a resource. I wanted it to be a go-to place that people could go and discover, learn, grow, think, reflect, all of those things.
Yeah, and I suppose what are some of the key messages that have been emerging over the last year? As you said, it's been a year of work, 30 amazing episodes. What kind of key messages are coming out, do you think, from these very varied and if you like, different perspectives?
Well, key messages, I guess, are not going to surprise anybody. We have local authorities that have had resources, have resource deprivation,
Mm-hmm.
and that creates very specific types of challenges
Yeah.
for local offer and preventative services.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what I'm seeing is that schools have become a funnel in lots of ways to do a lot more. I personally think schools are very well placed to do that work because they
Yeah.
spend the most time with children. So that's
Yeah.
not something that concerns me. I think that's a very good thing. I think what's not a good thing is when I'm in a school where their resources have been depleted exponentially, or there might be a school that doesn't have lots of pupil premium funding coming in, doesn't have very many free school meals, but might have lots of issues around attachment, but doesn't have the resources to, for example, create a nurture space or something. So I think that's a key theme around the country. What I'm also seeing is a kind of desire to, I see us all fumbling around in the grey area, because we are in a particular moment of time globally that is utterly fraught with binary thinking on every possible level. There's something really easy about moving into that space that actually leaves many of us quite lost and bereft, because the grey area is a space that doesn't need to be quite so uncomfortable, and might actually stop us all, buying into this divisive narrative that we can hear around us. So I think part of working around trauma responsive, trauma aware and attachment aware environments, and as I say, that's not just in schools, that's across many services, is almost a wonderful mirror reflection of something else that I think many people don't want. They don't want to be that, but they don't know how to get to the other space.
Yeah. So I suppose my next question then is around that sort of increased knowledge and understanding around, the impact of, for example, early childhood trauma experiences, or the importance of attachment theory to underpin the work of let's start with teachers in that particular context. How do you think that sort of knowledge and understanding has changed since you've been running this particular series of podcasts and videos and so on?
Well, it's really interesting. I mean, I was training for probably about a year before I realised that teacher training did not have child development and attachment awareness as part of its initial teacher training.
Some don't.
No. Well, I recognise that now, but and it might be worth just mentioning now how we met and how we've come to be having this conversation, because you were a tutor of mine at Oxford Brookes when I did my master's.
That's right.
Yeah, and you were running the module on dealing with
perspectives on challenging behaviour.
Alternative perspectives on challenging behaviour. That's right.
Yeah, still running.
Do you? Well, you've written a whole. Listen, I'll start interviewing you in a minute. That's yeah. So. And I think that was certainly one of the things I became aware of quite early on in training, and now incorporate into every training, into every arena, that knowledge around child development and attachment awareness. But what became clearer, I think, by coming to Brookes was recognising that actually some universities, and Brookes being one of them, were incorporating this into their initial teacher training, and some not, which begs the question, what is the overall strategy nationally about how teachers enter into education? Because to my mind, having teachers who are with children all day, not understanding how children are built and not understanding how we're built, to me seems bizarre. I was shocked. And I'd spent many years believing and thinking that I was dealing with people who understood something about children. And if they'd done a psychology degree or even the old BEd, then they would have had certainly a working knowledge of that, psychology especially. But sometimes I've met teachers who did the BEd years ago, which was a 4-year entry. Right. Which would have had that in it. So how have we changed? Well, I think there is a bigger conversation about that now than there was. I certainly think teachers also that I speak to feel a bit shortchanged. Well, why weren't we taught this? Why, there's not a reluctance to know about it. it's like, well, why wouldn't we?
Yeah.
And certainly since we first met, so that would have been 2 or 3 years ago now, maybe 3 years ago. I think things have changed dramatically. I think the language that I was using 3 years ago is now much more mainstream. And I say mainstream lightly, but it's much more likely that people will be having those same conversations. And I didn't feel that 3 years ago at all. I mean, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's interesting. I mean, I would have been, interested to ask then about the kind of the need for change at kind of policy level and how that might then have an impact further down the school. I think something that's really positive is that now attachment gets a mention in, for example, the code of practice, so the Special Education Needs Disabilities code of practice, but that's very specifically around attachment disorder, which, as we know, is a much rarer type of need in our mainstream school context. I think there has been reviews of initial teacher education previously. The Carter Review, for example, that did mention the importance of child and adolescent development and understanding about attachment. But it seems to me at the moment there's a kind of clash at a level of policy around behaviour and discipline, and then a kind of more relational, understanding about attachment needs and particularly behaviour, and how to understand behaviour in the classroom. I mean, what's your thoughts there around some of the sort of tensions around these more relational approaches and these more kind of, if you like, if I say zero tolerance, no excuses type approaches in our schools at the moment?
Well, I don't think there's any place for a zero tolerance approach in a school, because it flies in the face of, in the very least, it flies in the face of the fact that we learn through getting things wrong. And this idea that, you have this one strike and you're out.
Yeah.
In the context of children, is, I don't even have a word for it. I mean, I find it deeply distressing. And I speak as somebody who spent quite a lot of school life in isolation, in a music room. So we didn't have isolation booths, we had music rooms, those little tiny ones that you'd go and
practice room.
Practice rooms, yeah. So that was where I was sent to for much of what we might call now Year 8. And in the context of what was going on in my life at the time, which was entering into care and living in a variety of different spaces, I think we can safely look back on that and think about that child and what was going on in terms of a relational approach to understanding what was happening for me. So it's kind of, so there is a personal element to my feelings about it, but actually if I move into a professional and academic space, there is no research that validates that as something that helps and supports people's learning. And one of the really interesting parts of that discussion that we see unfold on Twitter is that discussion usually comes from people who are pro evidence-based towards teaching, and actually are the people who are least likely to present evidence to support why they do what they do. And that cognitive dissonance, that incongruent approach is strange. It's a strange one, and I don't really know how to approach it, because I certainly don't want to disconnect. I want to stay connected to people.
I think the danger is the reality of the experiences for a significant minority of children, which then end up having that sense of not belonging in a particular school community. And, the experience of isolation for however long, the experience of fixed term exclusions, the experience of, permanent exclusions we're seeing arise now in the number of alternative provisions, for example. We're seeing policies where, children are almost excluded at the point of admission because the policies are so clear around, this is a zero tolerance school, for example. And I think it's a real concern. I mean, I'm exploring a 12-week module at the moment around alternative educational provisions, and looking at the kind of evidence for these kind of approaches, and as you say, actually, the evidence suggests the opposite, really, around that need for belonging and sense of community and relational experience. And yet, at the level of policy, we're moving more towards, I think, a sort of segregated, separated experience for many children and young people, which I'm really quite concerned about. And I think that does reflect a lack of awareness and understanding potentially around the role of a whole number of different professionals in these kind of educational contexts. But what we're thinking about really are children and young people, and the later impact on their social emotional development and their kind of self-esteem, their self-belief, all that kind of stuff there, I think, which is quite a concern, really, at the moment.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree, and I've been to some fantastic alternative provisions that have been built alongside, I put a tweet up this morning, building prisons, building walls, building alternative provisions. If you make the alternative provisions absolutely fantastic, what you're actually doing as well, and I've been into some new builds, what you're actually doing is you're creating a space for all those children that those local schools don't want to have. And that is massively problematic, because education for all is supposed to mean education for all. Either it is or it isn't. Let's be open about it,
So my undergraduates this week are doing an online forum discussion. If there were no alternative educational provisions, where would these children be educated and how?
I love that. And that's almost a coaching question, isn't it? What if you knew what it looked like to keep those children in school, what would it be?
Yeah, what would it be? How can our European friends, our European colleagues, not have special schools, for example? Italy, Sweden, and so on. They don't have these, these number of different provisions, and we do have a kind of hierarchy of next steps, if you see what I mean, for certain children, don't we? So, isolation, fixed term exclusion, permanent exclusion, pupil referral unit, local authority or academy special school, independent special school, residential special school, where next? So, there's that sort of movement away from the sense of community. And again, don't get me wrong, I've worked in special schools, as a deputy head of a special school previously. What I like to do is invite head teachers from these schools to talk about the way they work with these children and young people, which is often, much, different in terms of smaller class sizes, nurturing experiences, all that kind of alternative curriculum, pedagogy. But what about learning these lessons and applying them into mainstream school? In terms of, if the funding that goes into special schools were taken and put back into mainstream schools, or the schools of the future were built slightly differently, I think it's now the time to imagine or reimagine, educational establishments, if you like, and think about alternative ways of working with these children and young people.
Or actually ways that are in line with 21st century life. Because we're applying principles that are not aligned with the experiences that the children and young people are having and are being wired up with. And I think that's massively problematic. And clearly young people and children are really struggling with that. We've got, a rise in poorer mental health. We've got a rise in exclusions. We've got less. If you listened to the previous podcast with Sally, adult free spaces are abundant, and this is a problem because we have these. Oh, and the other thing that Sally said, you must have a listen, which I just know that the people who are very, wanting to have a research base under everything but don't have one would really struggle with, is this idea that actually criminal exploitation takes place in specifically targeted schools that have high exclusions.
Right. Yeah. And it's also been the same, around care experienced children and young people as well, hasn't it? So I mean, there's this sort of awareness of these vulnerable spaces, if you like. And I hate the term vulnerable, don't get me wrong, but these kind of spaces that are targeted specifically, around particular children and young people, which I think is again really worrying and dangerous. Yeah.
And I guess also there's the idea then that those children are not going to come into adulthood, and that's been something that I've felt passionately about for decades. This idea that children's services end at 18, and that's it, done. Oh, hello, adult services will medicalise your experience because, of course, you've never been a child. So I think what I'd really like to see, if I had like my dream kind of way of thinking about things, and I've also raised two children who have transitioned into adulthood, and that has been far more learned than I would have liked it to be, should we say. Said every parent who, I think what the 14 to 19 agenda that once popped up, I think is an interesting place to revisit. That removes this whole academic, non-academic space for young people in terms of employment opportunities and academic opportunities. And then I'd like to see a transition space across all the services between, say, 16 and 25. That understands neuroscience, that understands brain development, that understands human development, and that can support that transition, that for some children, young people, depending on their specific vulnerabilities, and we know who all those children are, because they're the children who are likely to, have difficulties at school on many levels. I'd like to see something that acknowledged the research and the knowledge that we have about that period of time and how we support those children and young people the best we can to transition into adulthood. I think that would be, if that could happen, I think that would be life-changing and cycle breaking rather than cycle making.
I mean, interestingly as well, go back to the sort of, the ambitions of the Code of Practice for children with special education needs disabilities. That really was the intention was to bring together health, education and social care. But hasn't happened as effectively as perhaps people would have liked to have. But why not have that ambition for all children, irrespective of additional needs and so on? It's that kind of holistic way of understanding, the child within a particular, it's Brofenbremer, isn't it? It's like the Russian doll, the child in the middle and this side, it's all about family, community, all that kind of stuff. And I think as well, it does reflect this kind of very, competitive society that we're living in at the moment in terms of, school, back to my experience, kind of school accountability around those that are going to do well and those that perhaps won't do quite so well based on, measures of achievement, attainment and so on. I think that, what you're feeling about this sort of, the experience of our children and young people around this highly competitive societal experience that they're in the middle of at that time during adolescence and so on.
Well, actually, I have to be honest, it's very, very difficult to tap into that. And I think that's part of the problem, is that the generational gap is so vast, because I simply cannot imagine what it is like to have grown up your life online. I simply cannot imagine the impact of going to school, having difficulties, and those difficulties being in your presence 24 hours a day. I simply cannot imagine growing up and developing in a culture where what you look like is on display every moment of every day. I simply cannot imagine what it is like to be handed an iPad in a school setting rather than have someone listen to me read. Then this is a challenge. This is a challenge because by being unable to imagine that, for many of us, we have a willingness to seek to try and imagine that. What I'm seeing around punitive approaches to education is that there isn't a willingness to imagine that. There isn't a desire to imagine that. This is how it is. This is what we're doing. And you either align with it or you don't. Because actually, if we have to imagine that, then as parents, people have to do things differently. If you're going to tap into what impact that's having on the children in your classroom, it is not possible to not think about the impact that your behaviour is having on your children. And that is difficult in a society that is very judgmental about parenting, particularly mothering. It's very difficult to be vulnerable about the things you got wrong, about the things you would have liked to have done better. And to have that received with empathy, understanding, compassion, and oh my goodness, I know, wasn't it hard?
Non-judgment, essentially. Non-judgment, I think, really importantly. I mean, I think that's very true, and I think that lots of research around children as young as 5 being given, you know, tablets and so on to pacify, if you like, and all the important stuff there around, you know, that relational connection with eye gaze and so on that's missing then between family communities and so on, around that developing relational aspects and so on. And again, I had a student do an undergraduate dissertation around screen time for 5-year-olds, and actually it was quite surprising that the parents and carers and so on didn't realise quite how much time their children were spending on these on these on this sort of form of technology, in the absence of spending time with the family community and so on. So I think, and again, that, you know, as you said, the idea, this whole sort of persona, if you like, online around this sort of comparison to peers and others, and I think it is a real concern, isn't it, around body image and mental health and all that kind of stuff, isn't it? So
yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I suppose you've interviewed some, I say, you know, from the beginning, you know, 30 incredibly interesting and engaging interviews. What have been some of your highlights, do you think, over the last year?
Well, do you know what? I am the luckiest girl in the world, because people want to talk to me. And I think as a podcast host, that is like, that you have to come into it like that, because if nobody wanted to talk to me, there wouldn't be a podcast. So I feel incredibly fortunate that for whatever reason, people are happy to come and have a chat on the podcast and talk about what they're doing. And I guess also people know that I have quite a broad audience, so it helps share work, and we want to share our work. If things are going well, we want to share that. So highlights for me, I mean, it started off, and I was really quite rubbish. I have to tell you that my if I ever had the opportunity to start all over again, I'd want to be KAD, investigative journalist, you know, war correspondent. And I have to tell you that I'm pretty rubbish actually at being an investigative journalist, war correspondent. So I started off with Melissa Berry, and I didn't start it off as an audio. I started it off as a YouTube. I was interested in talking to her because she's very interested in Bruce Perry's neurosequential model and sport, which fits in with my views around informal interventions, such as music, sport, drama, the things that give us that rhythm, that repetitiveness, that somatic experience that can help us integrate some of the things that have happened to us. And so that's a piece of work that she was doing, and also for herself had really undertaken her journey of recovery through sport. So that's where it all started, and I thought, I quite like this. So it kind of went from there. I thought, this is really good, this is really interesting, and people started listening, and so I kind of built on that and did a few more, and watched the numbers go up and up and up, and I thought, right, I'm going to have to get myself a bloody jingle.
Just keep going,
So so then I got an intro and an outro. I know, and I thought, I've got to actually professionalize this, because actually these conversations are what people need to hear and don't ordinarily in their work time have time to listen to. And the wonderful thing about audio is, of course, you can have it on in the car, you can have it while you're running, you can have it while you're cycling. Audio offers you an opportunity to engage in something. It's not as tiring. I find reading has got harder and more tiring on the eye. So audio supports that, and it gives access to listening to things that people might not have if they have difficulties concentrating or focusing, or some of those other things. So highlights, I guess. I mean, Jules came on, Jules Dorby. That was pretty good. Really liked talking to her, and sometimes it's the conversation after the conversation that's really good.
It's always when you stop the recording, isn't it? And
yes,
you should press it again, double record, I think.
Absolutely. So that was great. Rob Lowe, I mean, really, really good stuff. Guy based in Cambridge, does lots of stuff about relationships and relational work. And again, my interest around that is that people talk about how they've got the focus is relationships, and we run a school that's built on da 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 da. We were talking about this yesterday. I was training yesterday the 2 schools, and we were talking about the buzzwords that go into the marketing material, and how rubbish it is sometimes, you know. And that's what I was finding, that people were talking about relationship building, and well, what does that mean? I even created an infographic to sort of help people think about what are relational behaviours that help us connect. And Rob's work is really all around that. So that's a really, that was a bit of a highlight. Sally, the previous one that I've just done, a phenomenal, candid conversation about criminal exploitation that not enough people are having. They're having them in the cities, but they are not having them in the towns. And if you're an hour away, even, you know, if you're only an hour away on train to London, you know, you probably have
country lines, isn't it?
Yeah.
Stuff.
So that was good. Nick Hardwick. That was a great one, not least because I knew him as a 17-year-old homeless teenager coming out of care in central London. And he was the CEO then of Centrepoint, but he's since been Her Majesty's Inspector of Prisons and CEO of Refugee Council. So we were able to talk a lot about that. But actually there's something for me about when we were looking and reflecting back at the 80s, how some things have changed and some things really haven't.
Interesting. What again? How could you summarise that? Do you think in a?
Well, what we were talking about was that I mean, I did quite a lot of talks and things and media stuff for Nick, and that was very revolutionary. So one of the things that I did was a Jon Snow news program.
I think I've seen a clip. That's right.
Yeah. And you know, because I was quite articulate and bolshy and all the rest of it. But what I didn't realise until I spoke with him was how unusual it was at the time to place lived experience voices into the media. And actually, Jon Snow was one of the very few people willing to take the risk, you know. And what happened, of course, was there was a bishop on there who I did give a little bit of a telling off to, much to everyone's horror and shock. But what Nick really wanted to do with that media campaign was to shift that focus away from the idea that homelessness was about old men clutching a bottle in a paper bag, that actually there was this whole vast range of young people coming out of children's homes with nowhere to go. And so, and we talked also about sexual exploitation, because that was a massive issue in central London. But the target were boys. And I remember very vividly things like boys coming, so not dissimilar to what we have now, boys who had been groomed coming in to do the grooming. That's that chain that gets to the real to the new recruits, if you like. And I remember running down the road screaming at a car, and feeling very protective of the boys. And we were talking about the irony of that, really, because I was so vulnerable myself. But I didn't feel like that. I felt very capable and protective of other people, you know.
And I think as well, you know, touching on the lived experiences and the kind of personal perspectives, I think, you know, I think that's a really powerful way of, introducing experiences to others that perhaps, you know, would not have come across, other than maybe news media reports and so on. But I think that's a really powerful way of, you know, getting messages out there, really, isn't it? The kind of, you know, personal perspectives, the lived experience angle.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that's really helpful in doing that is how it shifts and challenges people's perceptions and judgments about what somebody who's had those experiences must look like, must live like, must be like. And I mean, I am so lucky that my trajectory was altered by a number of charities that happened to support me in housing, support me in education. I also got sober, where, this whole range of things collided all at the same time.
Yeah.
But, I walked alongside so many other paths because of the places I'd come from.
Yeah.
And that was the other thing that I think me and Nick were talking about, which was, sometimes I feel a bit uncomfortable about that. How did I get out of that?
Yeah.
But that's for another day, probably.
Yeah. Well, I suppose what I should ask really, what does the future look like? I mean, the series 1, you're coming to, you're coming to a sort of closure on this one. You're going to take a bit of time away, which is really important, I think, and to refresh and so on. What's next season going to look like? What are your ambitions for next season's podcast and video cast?
Well, I've already got 3 people booked in January to have recordings with. So I can tell you that I have Dr. Karen Treisman is going to be on the podcast.
Yeah. Therapeutic Treasure Box. And so
on. Yeah. Joanne Alper.
Okay.
So that's. So her work is around adoption.
Okay, great.
And her latest book is looking at that impact for birth mothers.
Right, okay. Yeah.
Which is another area that has been so neglected. Yeah. Women who haven't been able to keep their child or have had their child removed have had no voice for so long. Yeah. So it's really nice to start to see research and writing and talking and thinking and services responding to that. Annie, who was on the podcast as another highlight, talks very candidly about her experience of having her children removed and her fight to get one of them back.
Yeah.
So there's some exciting stuff coming up. I cannot wait, I tell you. But yes, it's time for me to just put the Rode microphone to one side and just have a bit of a break and feel really. And also, I thought it'd be good for people to have a chance to catch up. 30 episodes, even though I keep them quite short, is a lot, and people might well want to spend some of their Christmas time. They might.
It's a huge resource. I mean, they're going on all my reading lists. I hope you don't mind it at the university.
Love it.
But they're definitely, and the fact that they're open access as well, I think is really important, isn't it? And they're not stuck behind any sort of paywall or anything like that. They're completely free. As you say, audio, visual, however you fancy to engage in them, they're there. Yeah. But I think what I've been impressed with is the variety of conversations and the kind of, I think the personalisation of those more informal conversational style overviews. I think is really important. I wish you all the very best for these future podcasts. It's really interesting.
Thank you.
I'd love for you to come and offer possibly an overview of your work to some of our students at the university if you'd have the time, maybe when you return from your break in January sometime.
Oh, go on then, John, for you.
Get that in there at the end.
Well done. Yeah. No, it would. You know that I would come and do that. And I think that was something else that really, just as an end note, struck me as the power of the podcast. So you're saying you've put that on your reading list. Goldsmiths University also have the podcast and my book on their reading lists. And actually the podcast is driving conversations about change within the education department. And that, I think, wow, that makes it all worthwhile for me.
Yeah, and I think as well, it does demonstrate, this sort of, actually the size of the community with these kind of interests, passions, and I think it's definitely a movement that's growing, isn't it? In terms of this awareness about, I think the awareness about the impact of distress really at times, and our responses to the needs of these children and young people. So that's what I hope for the future. My research is focused all around the role of compassion in education, and looking particularly at, at the moment, teachers' well-being, which is having an impact. Is actually being impacted on all these kind of external and, if you like, internal experiences of distress in their work, because they're often highly caring and compassionate individuals. But like the NHS, for example, in the caring professions, it can be quite hard to care sometimes because of all these other impacts and external factors. And I think again, that growing responsibility and awareness around children's social and emotional needs and mental health. We started off thinking about that at the beginning. I think whilst that awareness is raised, there are concerns that we don't have the clinical training and so on. But from my perspective, it's much more about connection, belonging, relational experiences that I think features throughout your podcast series, which is that's what I hope for the future, is that kind of compassionate understanding about this these kind of experiences and so on. So. That's how I'd like to conclude.
And that's why you're the perfect person to interview me, because it's about how we move into that way of being. Mm-hmm. That's a way of being. So thank you so much for interviewing me, Jon.
Oh, it's been a pleasure to talk to you, Lisa. It really has, and I've really enjoyed our conversation. I mean, I suppose we've had an opportunity to reflect on this year and think about the future. Is there anything else you'd like to offer as a kind of concluding summary?
I think I would just like to say that my unwavering belief that people are incredible and amazing, and all the people that I come across working in all the services are compassionate and absolutely doing their best, sometimes in some of the most dire circumstances. And I feel so much love towards those people. Yeah. And when I see somebody lift their head up from that really messy space and say, no, that is not how you're going to treat this child and young person. That, for me, that's the gold. That's the gold.
Mm-hmm. We need more agitators, don't we? More advocates and agitators. I think.
We do, Jon.
It's been wonderful to talk to you, Lisa. Thank you very much for your time this morning.
Thank you so much.